This video is an exploration of the late philosophical views of Max Scheler as outlined in his book, The Human Place in the Cosmos, which was published in 1928, the year that he died. This is the final vision of existence that Scheler arrived at during his life, his final understanding of the universe and of our place in it. In his introduction to the edition you can see on the screen here, Eugene Kelly calls the book an adventure in high philosophy. He continues, quote, "It contains all the elements expected of the grandest human struggle to achieve broadness of vision, profundity, lucidity, and wisdom, careful analysis of ideas, attention to established fact, bold metaphysical speculation, reverence for the highest and last things, and a moral teaching that inspires striving for the best that can be achieved in human life." End quote. This is an incredibly apt description, I think. I'll put a link to the book in the video's description. You can read it perfectly legally and perfectly free on the Internet Archive. Scheler was well renowned in his day, but unfortunately has come to be largely overlooked as other philosophical trends swept the humanistic focus of his philosophy away. Yet the progenitor of one of these trends had this to say about him when he died, quote, "Quite apart from the extent and variety of his productivity, Max Scheler was the strongest philosophical power in contemporary Germany, nay, in contemporary Europe. In fact, in all of present-day philosophy." End quote. That was a quote from Martin Heidegger, a year after publishing the existentialist classic Being and Time, the very first copy of which he sent to Max Scheler. Where Scheler's legacy has continued, however, is in the Catholic Church. That is, in a way, ironic. While for many years of his life Scheler was one of the most important Catholic philosophers, by the time of the work we'll be exploring today, he had abandoned the Christian religion and developed ideas very different from Catholic or Christian orthodoxy. Nevertheless, the work from his Catholic period had a huge influence on Pope John Paul II and through him on much of contemporary Catholic thought. While this is wonderful in itself, it does have the unfortunate side effect that, to the extent Scheler is discussed today, it's the works from his middle or Catholic period. And many of his contemporary commentators are Catholic, and so his later works tend to be downplayed or dismissed, despite Scheler's insistence that they actually represent an important improvement on his earlier views. So what was Scheler's final vision contained in this last of his books? Well, to attempt a nutshell description, it is of a universe divided between two opposed fundamental principles, spirit and impulsion. A universe not created by an all-good, all-powerful personal God, but rather one in which God himself is in process of coming into being through human beings, through the interpenetration of these two basic principles. This is, in my estimation, a brilliant and unique metaphysical vision. Even if it is not the final truth, as an attempt to grasp the truth, it is incredibly fruitful in helping us to think about ourselves and about fundamental things. And I hope you'll get a sense of this as we go. Now, before I dive into the book, I'll say just a bit more about who Max Scheler was and what he contributed to philosophy, so at least you'll have a sense of why he's significant and what he's up to. Born in 1874, Scheler was a German philosopher who took a phenomenological approach throughout most of his work. Put simply, phenomenology focuses on phenomena, on experience. It examines the structure of experience itself as it is given to us, bracketing other theories and considerations such as what may really be behind it. He applied this type of analysis to many different fields. For example, he clarified and extended the Nietzschean concept of Ressentiment, the resentment felt by the powerless that warps perception of value such that power itself appears evil and their own weakness a virtue. He also analyzed phenomena of intersubjectivity, phenomena like empathy and sympathy, in which we seem to feel with other people. Through careful attention to these phenomena, he disposed of the problem of other minds. How do we come to know that other people exist? Scheler's analysis showed that there is no isolated I to begin with, for which the question of other minds could be a problem. We are essentially related to others in the most basic structure of our experience, and we can really feel what they are feeling. What Scheler's most well known for, however, is his application of phenomenology to the realm of ethics and value. This revealed an intrinsic order of values, that they exist in a hierarchy, from the lowest values of the pleasant or the agreeable to the highest values of the holy. Now, I've made a whole video on this previously, and you can find a link to this also in the description. You can also find a link to the book itself that I'm talking about, and by the way, to every book mentioned on this slide. His approach to ethics is known as material value ethics. Here, material means non-formal because it attends to the multiplicity and particularity of the values that motivate our behavior, rather than trying to find some formal rule by which we should act. Indeed, the title of his tome on value ethics is the rather long-winded Formalism in Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Values, which the academic literature on Scheler tends to abbreviate to the first word formalism, or in German, Formalismus. And so, like I mentioned, you can find a link to this big book, really important book, in the description that you can read on Internet Archive. Scheler's thought is typically divided into 2 or 3 periods. The most significant transition occurred around 1922 when he began moving away from the Catholic theism he had become renowned for into his final period of thought. One of the greatest products of this Catholic period was certainly his book, The Eternal in Man, which was a phenomenological exploration of religious experience. As with values and our awareness of others, he finds that religious phenomena can't be reduced to anything else. The religious is an essential, fundamental part of the structure of human experience. By studying what religious acts disclose to us, he arrives at a view of God, well, remarkably similar to the Catholic dogmas he already adhered to. But a few years later, however, this had changed. Scheler left the Catholic Church and began to develop a different, independent kind of theology to go with a new metaphysics and anthropology. I intend to make another video on this shortly, specifically focusing on the change that Scheler's outlook underwent and the reasons behind this change. During this later period, he also published work on the sociology of knowledge, the study of how the social context in which ideas arise determine their content. In this field, he was a pioneer. He's generally considered to be the founder of it. This is when his 2 basic principles of spirit and impulsion come into play, or first came into play. Spirit provides the ideas that impulsion, the various forces of actual human history, either embody or ignore. Thus, you could say intellectual and cultural history is determined by both material and spiritual factors, though in different ways. Finally, a note on 2 items on this list I haven't yet expanded on, the first and the last. Earlier, I quoted the title of Scheler's book on value ethics and said it was long-winded. I lied. It's even more long-winded, the complete title being Formalism in Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Values, a new attempt toward the foundation of an ethical personalism. That last word is crucial. Scheler had a massive influence on virtually all subsequent personalist philosophy. As a worldview, personalism is diverse and a bit hard to define, but what unites the various strands is an emphasis on the uniqueness, value, and ontological irreducibility of the person. In the thought of his Catholic period, this included both the human person and the divine person. God was conceived in line with Christian orthodoxy as a personal being of infinite power, wisdom, and goodness. As I mentioned before, Scheler was a huge influence on Pope John Paul II. Before he became Pope, he had fused Scheler's ethical personalism with the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, the official philosophy of the Catholic Church, to produce the philosophy of Thomistic personalism. However, in the later period of Scheler's thought, his understanding of God changed considerably. While the significance of the human person didn't wane, Scheler came to hold that God isn't some eternally perfect person. Instead, God is in the process of coming to be through the human person. We'll look at this in more detail in a minute. Suffice it to say that toward the end of his life, Scheler became deeply interested in questions of philosophical anthropology, the inquiry into the essence or nature of the human being. Indeed, he's also widely credited as the founder of philosophical anthropology as an independent discipline. He intended to publish a major work on this, projected for the year after his death, but unfortunately he was never able to complete it. All we have really are a few fragments, as I understand it. His life was cut tragically short by a heart attack at the age of 53. What he did manage to complete, though, is the book we'll be looking at today, The Human Place in the Cosmos, which was intended to be a kind of preparatory outline of the more significant work to come. And with that, we'll turn to the book itself. The Human Place in the Cosmos was published in 1928, which, as I mentioned, was the year of Scheler's death. It was the last of his works published in his lifetime. It had its genesis the year before when Scheler delivered a lecture at Hermann von Keyserling's School of Wisdom in the German city of Darmstadt. To give you a sense of Scheler's popularity at the time, the lecture hall was completely packed and he spoke for 3 or 4 hours uninterrupted. In the words of John Raphael Stauder, who wrote one of the 2 biographical books about English that exist in English, titled Max Scheler, An Intellectual Portrait, quote, Scheler's lecture left the audience spellbound. After a long, fearsome silence, they broke into loud applause and stamped their feet as only a crowd of enthusiastic Germans can do. Scheler walked out of the hall flanked by Count Hermann Keyserling and Carl Jung, as the audience stood in respect and admiration inspired by his last words. End quote. What he delivered to that spellbound audience was a sketch or outline of a new metaphysics grounded in a philosophical anthropology. The latter subject seems to have been Scheler's main preoccupation throughout his philosophical career. In the book's preface, he remarks, quote, Ever since the awakening of my philosophical thinking, the question, what is the human being and what is his place in being, has occupied me more fundamentally than any other question I have dealt with. End quote. Although the primary focus of the work is philosophical anthropology, what is the nature of the human being, Scheler believed this to be the most important window into the nature of being itself. So the anthropological and metaphysical aspects of the work are necessarily intertwined. Likewise, although these 2 disciplines are distinct from phenomenology, Scheler's phenomenological approach still informs all his insights. His paying close attention to phenomena as they are given in order to reach an intuitive recognition of their essence. What Scheler finds when he attends carefully to the nature of human being are 2 basic principles opposed to each other, Geist or spirit, and Drang, which is usually translated impulsion. Spirit is a somewhat awkward word in English, with the dominant meaning in common use being a kind of immaterial soul. But in German, Geist carries far more of the connotations of rationality, intellect, and culture. So Scheler is invoking these as well by his use of the term in his system. Put very simply, impulsion or Drang is the force or energy that drives all life, whereas spirit or Geist is the rational principle behind the essential structures of the world and the human mind. Impulsion presses outward and onward, contending with the resistance of existent being. Spirit reflects and comprehends the essences of being. We could picture Drang emerging upward from the lowest levels of the cosmos, while Geist descends downward from the discarnate heights. They meet and interpenetrate in the human being. Without impulsion, we wouldn't be organisms or existent beings at all, and without spirit, we would be merely animals, totally bound to our drives and environment, if we would be at all. Through their interpenetration, originally blind impulsion gains sight from spirit, while originally powerless spirit gains force and actuality from impulsion. Now, just note that this is a simplification, and there are some big interpretive difficulties here that we'll touch on at the end of the video. In any case, we'll unfold each of these two basic concepts in more detail as this video proceeds. Scheler's new metaphysics also deals with the divine. This was probably the most scandalous aspect for his Christian readers. Scheler abandons his previous commitment to an orthodox conception of an eternal, morally perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful, personal God, distinct from human beings, in favor of a conception that has been described as pantheistic or panentheistic. Everything proceeds from the same non-personal ground, divine ground, and to the extent that God is personal, he did not exist eternally, but is in a process of coming to be through the human being. Scheler begins the book by noting attention on what we mean by the term human being. On the one hand, a human being is a particular kind of animal. On the other, human being is something fundamentally different from all animals, even opposite the concept of animal. The latter idea of the human being is an essential concept. It seems to be inherent in our experience of humans, rather than being derived from natural science. Here Scheler announces his theme, quote, to show whether or not this essential concept, which links humans to a special place that is not comparable to any other special place any other species may have, is a justified concept, end quote. To do this, he'll draw on both phenomenology and science, tracing the ascent of impulsion through the life of plants and animals to human beings, its interpenetration by spirit in the human being, and then finally to the source of both principles in the world ground or ground of being itself. He prefaces his discussion of the ascending levels of life with a somewhat provocative statement. The boundary of the psychic coincides with the boundary of life. Now here, psychic means obviously not telepathic or something like that, but psychological, mental, having mind. For Scheler, all of life has psyche, has mind. Later in the book, he further clarifies what this means. Quote, physiological and psychic processes are ontologically strictly identical. They are different only in a phenomenal sense. What we call physiological and psychological are but two sides from which we observe one and the same process of life. Hence, there is a biology from inside and one from outside, end quote. Now that's from page 53 of the 2009 translation by Manfred Frings, which is the version I'm using. It's the one that you saw on the initial slide, and it's also the one that I've linked to in the description. So the boundary of the psychic coincides with the boundary of life because life is psyche, seen from a particular perspective. Life is the underlying process that manifests physically on the one hand and psychically on the other, always at the same time. Life without mind is impossible. And the lowest form of life is the plant. In a sense, it appears plants are pure impulsion, pure drang. In Scheler's own words, quote, the lowest level of the psychic world, the steam as it were, which pushes forward and up into the highest stages of spiritual activities and which provides energy to the most tender acts of lucid goodness, is impulsion devoid of consciousness, sensation, and representation, end quote. Scheler goes on to say that at this level there is not yet any distinction between feeling and drives, let alone a differentiation into specific drives focused on specific ends. The drives specifically oriented to food and sex, for instance. These particularized drives are dependent on an organism's ability to move around to acquire food or a mate. But the plant is rooted in one place, relying on the sun, air, and soil for its nutrition, and fertilized by the agency of winds, birds, or insects. There is therefore only a, quote, general impulsion towards growth and reproduction, end quote. In the plant there is only a general movement, which is also itself an experiencing, a general away from and toward a direction, as with the plant's orientation to light and soil, which is at once a vague suffering or delight without specific objects. This is what the life of a plant is like. Now, 2 points of clarification that are needed here. The first is that Scheler appears to be using drang or impulsion in two different ways. One way is to indicate the force that pervades and propels all life, that can manifest in various different degrees of complexity, from the plant right up to the most sophisticated practical intelligence of primates. The other way in which he's using the term is to designate its most simple or basic manifestation in life. So although on this slide we see a hierarchy beginning with impulsion and ending with practical intelligence, it is important to remember that all of these are different manifestations of impulsion in life. And when we consider it at the level of the plant, we see its most simple, direct, uncomplicated manifestation and can therefore most easily apprehend its essence. So I think that's why Scheler uses this term in those two senses. Or at least this is the most obvious way to interpret what he's saying. Now, I'll have to qualify this a bit at the end of the video when I discuss a more subtle interpretation about what's going on here. The second point of clarification that's needed here is that even though plants, as the most basic form of life, have psyche, they are nevertheless not conscious. For Scheler, only animals have consciousness and only humans truly have self-consciousness. What plants have instead is a basic being for themselves and an inwardness which sets them apart from inanimate objects. Though not the same as consciousness, Scheler says this is an inwardness through which they are aware of themselves. So what is this inwardness distinct from consciousness? To understand this, we'll need a few more quotes from Scheler. First, on psyche and inwardness, quote, "It is the psychic aspect, such as autonomy, self-motion, and so on, that represents the primordial phenomenon of living beings," end quote. And another quote, quote, "The impression one has that plants are devoid of inwardness stems from the slowness of their vital processes. Under time-lapse photography, this impression disappears completely," end quote. And then, on sensation and consciousness, quote, "The most general concept of sensation consists in a reporting back of a living being's momentary organic and kinetic states to a center, plus a modification of movements that follow the next moment, again by virtue of this reporting back," end quote. And another quote, quote, "The essential direction of life, which is designated by such words as plant-like and vegetative, is a completely outward-directed impulsion. I am therefore using the term ecstatic impulsion in plants in order to characterize the total absence of the reporting back of organic states to a center that animals have, the total absence of a reporting back of life to itself, the total absence also of even a primitive reflex and of any conscious inner state, however faint," end quote. So the impulsion of a plant flows in one direction. It doesn't double back on itself, and yet at the same time it does have a unity, an autonomy that sets it apart from other things, an energy that, because of its unity and autonomy, necessarily has a certain coordination and coherence, which we can readily perceive when we watch a sped-up video of a plant. Because this unified field of impulsion is itself a vague experiencing, because the successful stretching of its leaves to the light is a primitive delight, the thwarted reaching of its roots through waterless soil is a primitive suffering. Because of this, the plant's impulsion is a unified field of awareness. In this very basic sense, the plant, like all life, is aware of itself. But it's not aware of itself or anything else in any clear and particular sense, because it has no center, as an animal has a nervous system and brain. So it has no representations, no sensations, no definite impressions of itself or its environment of any kind. We can approach the understanding of inwardness without consciousness, I think, by considering the unconscious aspects of our own minds, our underlying fears and desires that condition the rest of our thought and behavior, but which we don't recognize are there. These are mental, psychic, and for that matter, motivational, driven, and they are ours. They belong to the mental unity of our individual self, yet they are not conscious. Now, this may not be the same as the basic impulsion of plants, but at least gets us closer to it below the threshold of consciousness. So that's how I understand Scheler's distinction between the inwardness inherent in all life and the consciousness of animals and human beings. I mentioned that Scheler draws on science as well as phenomenology throughout his book, and he does so a number of times in the section on plants, particularly to show that they do not have reflexes or sensations. Now, I'm sure the scientific understanding of plants has advanced quite a lot since 1928, though I'm not conversant with it. But just beware that the understanding of plants that Scheler relies on here might not be exactly the same as today. And the same goes for all the other biological phenomena Scheler talks about in the book. Above the level of plants, a new factor comes into play: instincts. Once again, this isn't something utterly new, but is portrayed as a development of the basic impulsion. Scheler says explicitly that instincts are characterized by increases of specialization of impulsion and its qualities. So what are instincts? Scheler explains instinctive behavior as that which is purposeful for a species, has a fixed and unchanging rhythm, is useful to the relevant species without regard for the individual, and is independent of the number of trials the organism makes when facing a situation. Further, he explains that instincts condition sensations, not vice versa. Quote, "Whatever an animal can represent or sense is a priori governed and determined by the relation its instincts have to their environment." End quote. The animal sees what it needs to see in the way it needs to see it. And the very drive to see, claims Scheler, underlies factual seeing. It's not that we just passively see, just receive, let alone see everything. But this is dependent on the more general drive to be awake. When the drive to sleep overcomes it, we see nothing. In any case, at this level of life we have sensations, reflexes, some kind of neural center that information about the organism and its environment is fed back to. Here, we're in the domain of animals. Instincts are those complex, purposeful, inbuilt reflexes, you could say, that better enable species to interact with their environments. Though they're activated by sensation, their content is not determined by sensation, and the link between sensation and reaction is still incredibly close. Many of the points Scheler makes in this section of the book are to distinguish instincts from associative learning, which we'll look at shortly. Because instinctive beings have a neural center and sensations, they have consciousness. But of what kind? Scheler says the following. Instinctive knowledge is neither knowledge of representations, nor of images, nor even of thoughts. Rather, instinctive knowledge is feeling knowledge and is differentiated by values and value impressions. And furthermore, it is knowledge of attracting or repelling moments of resistance. End quote. For Scheler, the perception of value precedes other forms of perception. The first sense we get of something is its value. Then we form a clear sense of what it actually is. So instinctive beings have a differentiated consciousness of value in line with their instincts. Though still quite close to the undifferentiated impulsion of plants, this is nevertheless a significant development. Now, it's not clear that any species are solely instinctive. Based on current scientific knowledge, there are exceedingly few species of animal that have instincts yet appear to have no ability for associative learning. A little later in the book, Scheler says that, quote, "The principle of associative memory is at work among all animals to some degree or other," end quote. And he gives the example of arthropods, creatures like insects and crustaceans with segmented bodies and exoskeletons, as animals in which instinct is dominant. We'll talk about why shortly, but for this slide I've actually chosen a jellyfish, as there are apparently certain species of jellyfish that show no evidence of learning, at least for now, as far as we know. The levels build on each other, so the instinctive animal still has the basic impulsion of the plant within it. and animals of subsequent levels all have instincts. Now, because Scheler suggests the essential phenomena of the next two levels, associative learning and practical intelligence, arise together, and because he also says that all animals have associative memory of some kind, this implies that for Scheler, all animals have instinct, learning, and intelligence. They are all present together. What differentiates these levels from each other is what factor is predominant. In lower animals, the higher capacities are less developed and play only a minor role. The level of associative learning is the level of acquired habits, grounded in associative memory. These habits are conditioned by the actual experiences of the individual organism, and so are far more flexible than instincts. They also serve the individual, not primarily the species. Although Scheler doesn't talk about it in this way, as the language was still being developed when he was writing, associative learning can be divided into classical and operant conditioning. I'll explain it in this way to help us grasp what he's getting at here. Classical conditioning is the linking of two stimuli via repeated pairings so that one comes to elicit the same response as the other. The classic example of this is Ivan Pavlov's experiments with dogs, in which a bell rung repeatedly just before a dog was fed came to elicit the same salivation response as when it actually began to eat. The other type of associative learning is operant conditioning. This occurs when an organism learns by repeated adverse consequences of a particular behavior to avoid that behavior, or on the other hand, from repeated positive consequences to repeat that behavior. Rewards make you more likely to do something, punishments make you less likely, to put it simply. Scheler connects all of this with the psychological laws of association, developed by the British empiricists who noted the ways that certain thoughts tend to recur together. And he also brings in imitation or observational learning, when we learn to do something by repeating the actions of others, which could also be seen as another form of learning by association. As I mentioned just before, Scheler links a predominance of instincts to arthropods. In contrast, he links associative learning to vertebrates, and in particular, mammals. While arthropods, he says, have physically a chain-like enclosed structure, reflecting the rigidity of instinct and inhibiting the development of novel behavior, animals with a more flexible physical structure have the capacity for, quote, broad combinations of ever-new movements stemming from partial movements, end quote. These new, individually adaptive combinations of movements are bound together from partial movements mainly through the means of associative learning. In this section of the book, Scheler is careful to distinguish his position from an empiricism or behaviorism that would reduce our thought or behavior to associations. Just as there are no pure sensations perfectly proportionate to their stimulus, because all sensation is conditioned by instincts and drives, so there are no pure associations. Scheler remarks, quote, all associative memory is under the sway of the drives, needs, and tasks that determine them, end quote. So associative learning is just one factor in life, always in interplay with others, even when it becomes the predominant factor. Finally, at this level, we see the emergence of particularized drives. As associative learning partially liberates the individual from the species, it detaches it from the rigidity of instinctive rhythms. The instincts that were formerly integrated in service to the species become more free-floating. The sexual drive, the nutritive drive, the power drive, and become amenable to selective pursuit and satisfaction in ways that serve neither the species nor often the organism. Scheler uses the example of the sexual drive in dogs and primates, now disengaged from seasonal cycles. That these animals can satisfy this drive at any time, and even completely by themselves, can, well, become a problem. The highest animals possess a well-developed practical intelligence, what Scheler refers to more specifically as organically bound practical intelligence. This basically means that these animals can solve problems without relying on instinct or associative learning. They can make inferences about or have insight into a problem solution. It is practical intelligence because it always leads to actions. And it is organically bound because these actions always serve the goals of the animal's biological drives. In this section of the book, Scheler references the research that psychologist Wolfgang Köhler conducted with chimpanzees in the 1910s, which was some of the first to demonstrate insightful learning in non-human animals. He observed the chimps in his experiments use objects in novel ways to reach an item of food. This was often spontaneous, not dependent on a process of previous trial and error. Although at the time this was controversial, today it's scientifically well established that several species of animal have this kind of intelligence. As Scheler moves into his discussion of the human being, he notes the two main views about man's relation to animals prevalent at the time. First, the view that there is a sharp difference between humans and animals because humans possess the kind of insightful practical intelligence we've just been talking about, whereas animals do not. And second, that there's no essential difference between humans and animals because in fact both possess that intelligence. Scheler rejects both views and opts for a third. Human beings are unique, but it's not due to the practical intelligence that they share with animals. It's not even because humans have the power of free choice. Scheler believes that animals have a certain form of this too. From the center of their drives, they can, Scheler says, quote, act spontaneously on the constellation of their drives, which allows them to avoid nearby, more tempting advantages in favor of reaching greater advantages located at remoter distances, despite having to make detours to reach the latter, end quote. It appears this particular capacity for choice flourishes at the level of practical intelligence, though it may also be present in a more rudimentary form in lower animals. In any case, neither choice nor practical intelligence is what distinguishes humans from animals and gives us a special place in the cosmos. Even if we extended these capacities to infinity, Scheler says we wouldn't reach an adequate conception of the human being. What humans have that animals don't is something entirely different. Humans possess spirit. Now, the way Scheler presents it, this isn't just another level in the ascent of life from primal impulsion, another permutation of Drang as it grows in sophistication. According to Scheler, spirit or Geist is something fundamentally different, irreducible to life or psyche. If reducible to anything, he says, it would be to the world ground, the very basis of being. From this ground spring the two opposed principles, impulsion and spirit. So what exactly is spirit? The ancient Greeks were fascinated by it and called it reason or logos. Scheler's conception includes this but encompasses far more. Quote, in addition to the thinking of ideas, a specific type of an intuition of primordial phenomena and essential contents, and it encompasses also a specific class of volitional and emotive acts, such as kindness, love, repentance, awe, states of wonder, bliss, despair, and free decision-making, end quote. Now, in the rest of the book, Scheler focuses mainly on the intellectual intuitive aspect of spirit to clarify its essential nature and distinguish it from mere practical intelligence. But it's significant that he also lists these volitional and emotive acts. For more on these and what sets them apart from anything an animal could do or experience, I'd recommend taking a look at his theory of values as found in that 1916 tome, the Formalismus. By the way, in his third and final preface to that book, written in 1926, Scheler explicitly says that the ideas in it remain unaffected by the subsequent change in his metaphysical position. In the course we've traced for the ascent of life from plant to intelligent primate, there's been an increase in differentiation and sophistication at each new level, but all of this has been closely tied to impulsion. I originally had written, but all of this has been out of and for the sake of the expanding force of impulsion. And this certainly appears to be what Scheler's proposing, although there are reasons why this may not be the case. Once again, this is something we'll return to at the end of the video. For now, we can say that with each level of life, the organism attains new and more effective ways to assert itself, propagate itself, and overcome resistance in its environment. These transformations are in service to the impulse of life. But spirit doesn't exist to further life, and when it appears in the human being, it stands in a peculiar opposition to it. This opposition becomes clear in the first quality of spirit that Scheler discusses in depth, the ability of spirit to detach us from life. Here is an important passage. Quote, "We can find an ultimate determination of the concept of spirit when we have in view its culmination in the specific functions of knowledge and kinds of knowledge which only spirit can bestow on us. Then the ultimate determination of a being with spirit, no matter what its psychophysical makeup, is its existential detachment from organic being, its freedom and detachability, and the detachment of its center of existence from the bondage to, the pressure of, and the organic dependence on life and everything which belongs to life, and thus also its detachment from its own drive-related intelligence." End quote. Now, there's a straightforward way we can understand this. When we consider the kinds of knowledge we can attain to that don't essentially depend on practical intelligence or associative learning, to keep it simple, let's consider something the ancient Greeks revered, mathematics or geometry. When we consider these, we notice the quality of detachment from our particular environmental and individual ongoing life. That 5 and 3 is 8, or the truth of the Pythagorean theorem has nothing to do with my actual life, except only in that I sometimes need to make that calculation or happen to encounter right-angled triangles. But the particular things I count, or the particular triangles, aren't the objects of my knowledge. Rather, it's the essences of 5 and 3, the essence of the triangle. In my concern for the essences themselves, as well as their intrinsic order that I submit to in order to understand them, in this I am detached from my particular life. So that's one level of understanding this detachment, the most obvious and probably quite familiar as the core concern of Plato. But for Scheler it goes deeper than this. The detachment that characterizes a being with spirit makes it non-environmental, world open, to use Scheler's terms. Animals are ecstatically immersed in their environment. What they experience of the world around them is wholly shaped by their drives and instincts. Even the animal with practical intelligence and a certain kind of choice doesn't escape this. That intelligence is only activated by and only pursues biologically determined goals, and that choice is only between such goals. Scheler describes the closed loop the animal lives in with its environment. The animal's drives determine the environment it encounters. The animal makes a change in its environment in line with its drives, and this change in turn affects the animal's physiological and psychic states. But for a being with spirit, an opposite process occurs. First, such a being apprehends the whatness of a situation, what it is, so to speak, in itself, and the essences and essential relations inherent in it, independent of the drives that may have brought it to attention. In Scheler's words, quote, "Its comportment is motivated by the pure whatness of a complex of intuitions and representations that are raised into an object." End quote. Secondly, such a being freely inhibits or de-inhibits relevant drive impulses and reactions. And finally, the being is transformed by this encounter with new aspects of the world. World openness is this comportment toward reality such that a being with spirit is always, quote, shedding the spell of the environment, end quote, because we can always, at least potentially, look at the world with genuine interest in its own nature, and because we have a certain control over our own drives, our awareness of the world can continually expand. This provides Scheler a definition of the human being. Quote, "The human being is that X who can comport himself in unlimited degrees as world open. Becoming human is tantamount to being elevated to world openness by spirit." End quote. So it's our concern with the whatness of things and our ability to objectify that are key components of the human spirit that deliver us an ever-expanding world rather than a tightly constrained environment. To simplify just a little, impulsion cares about the existence of things, how they impinge upon my growing life. Spirit cares about what they are, their essence. Scheler says, quote, "Therefore spirit is matter of factness." Now the German word here is Sachlichkeit. It is determinable by what things themselves are. Only a living being which has spirit is able to complete such matters of factness. End quote. And with this comes our ability to objectify. An animal sees the world through its drives, but it doesn't see the drives themselves. It doesn't see its own drives themselves. A human does have this capacity. We can take our drives as intentional objects and in so doing gain distance from them. And this distance in turn supports our ability to take everything else as an object, including ourselves. This is the second quality of spirit Scheler discusses. It allows a being to, quote, objectify its very own physiological and psychic nature, and to also objectify its every single vital function, end quote. We are aware of the various aspects of our body and mind as our body and mind. As Scheler puts it, quote, animals can hear and see, but without knowing that they hear and see. An animal's psyche functions and lives, but it is no possible psychologist or physiologist, end quote. In Scheler's view, animals don't experience their drives as their own, but rather as, quote, dynamic attractions or rejections coming from things in the environment, end quote. In being able to objectify our own body and psyche, we overcome all these limitations of an animal. Because we can objectify our environment and ourselves in this way, we can situate ourselves within an objective world. For example, we can seamlessly relate experiences in different sensory modalities to each other as representing the same object. And because we can apprehend a persistent self, perceiving different permutations of an entity through time, we can identify that entity as one unified thing. In Scheler's view, the ability to objectify ourselves that spirit provides also gives us a, quote, perfectly developed category of thing and substance, end quote. Likewise, it gives us the sense of one unified, objective world space in which all things have their specific location. A dog may have lived in a garden for years and have been everywhere within it, but Scheler maintains that it doesn't thereby have a unified, unchanging spatial conception of the garden. Rather, it has only environmental spaces, changing with its movements through it. For the dog to have a conception of the garden independent of where it currently happened to be within it, it would need to turn its body and movements into intentional objects that it could factor into its understanding. The full fruition of these capacities comes with science, for which Scheler has high praise. Quote, "It is the magnificent accomplishment of science that the human being, with his accidental place in the cosmos, learns to reckon with himself and with the whole of his physical and psychic constitution as if he were handling an object placed among other objects in causal interconnections. The human being slowly gains an image of the world where objects and laws are completely independent of the human psychophysical organization, of human senses and their limits, and independent also of human needs and interests, in a world where objects and laws remain constant during all the changes in the human places in the cosmos, in the changes of human states of being, and in the organization of the human species and of sense experience." End quote. We just heard of the human being's accidental place in the cosmos, as though we were just an object among countless others. But this is only in regard to his psychophysical being. There's an important qualification to this, which is what Scheler focuses on next. Because, while the human being possesses the magnificent ability to objectify his own bodily and psychic natures, the spiritual core of his being can never be objectified. This is because, Scheler explains, quote, "Spirit is pure actuality. It exists only in freely carrying out its acts. Hence, spirit center, the person, is not objectifiable, nor is the person a thing-like being. The person is a constantly self-executing ordered structure of acts, and essentially a specific structure. The person is only in his acts and exists only through them. End quote. So a person is the specific unity of his intentional acts. Every person has a specific way of acting, of loving, valuing, thinking, relating, etc. This binds their acts together into a meaningful whole and makes them concrete rather than abstract, interchangeable with others. But there's no substance standing behind a person's acts, nothing that would remain without the acts themselves, that one could potentially apprehend as an intentional object. And while the unifying way or style of a person can be intuited by a kind of participation, by a sympathetic co-execution of another person's acts, it too cannot become present to one as an object. And yet, the person isn't nothing, because someone's acts have a real concreteness and coherence. The nature of our experience unceasingly demonstrates this. Our acts are intrinsically unified. They proceed from, to use a slightly different language, which Scheler intends to mean the same thing, they proceed from a spiritual center. And so the person is transcendent and superior to the world, which includes his own psyche and body, and so transcendent and superior even to himself. And this is necessarily so. Scheler argues the center from which the human being acts and objectifies the world cannot itself be a part of the world, and cannot even have a place in the world's space and time. It can only, says Scheler, lie in the supreme ground of being itself. We'll turn to the supreme grounds shortly, but to stay on the subject of how spirit manifests in the human being, it should now be clear that the self-consciousness of the human being, and Scheler holds that only the human being is truly self-conscious, that this self-consciousness doesn't merely consist in its ability to objectify its mind and body. Deeper than this, the human self-consciousness is the awareness of an absolute center of its being that transcends all objectification. Scheler calls the act by which we come to this awareness Sammlung, or ingathering. Quote, into our personal being we can only gather ourselves. We can only concentrate ourselves up on our personal being, but we cannot make it an object. End quote. This is a fundamentally different type of act than objectification. It suggests a kind of existential insight, or even deeper than this, perhaps a kind of meditative act, as in Eastern religions, where we apprehend the utter transcendence of the self. And we can see too how the sense of self-consciousness as self-objectification depends on this deeper sense. We can only objectify our psychic and physiological natures from a personal spiritual center that transcends them. We now get a sense for where the human place in the cosmos is. Essentially, our place is outside the cosmos. Toward the end of the book, there are a couple of moments when Scheler is almost explicit about this, and the commentator in my edition quips that for Scheler, as against Heidegger, the human being might be best characterized as being outside the world. But we don't want to be misled too much by this language. The human being is also a being in the world on the level of impulsion. But even as spirit, the human person is not some mystical substance maintaining some distance from the material world. As we've heard, Scheler insists that the person is not objectifiable, as any kind of substance would be, is not thing-like, is only in his acts and only through them. And so, in a funny way, this is actually an incredibly concrete conception of the human being, most transcendent and most concrete. We resolve some difficulties around this, I think, if we recognize that we're dealing with something that has no parallel among any of the objects we deal with. The person is simply sui generis, its own kind of being. And Scheler points out that this evasion of all objectification applies to other persons as well. Whilst we might come to know about others by objectifying various aspects of them, we only come to know them as persons through non-objectifying acts of identification, executing our acts in the same way as theirs, executing their acts with them, loving them, which is to say, identifying ourselves with their will and loving what they love. Finally, Scheler discusses a characteristic act of spirit in order to illuminate what spirit is. This is what he calls the act of ideation. He distinguishes this from all merely technical or discursive intelligence, which is not unique to human beings. Instead, ideation is, quote, the grasp of the essential qualities and structures of the world in terms of one example of some essential region, independently of the magnitude and number of observations and inductive reasoning from them, end quote. He uses an example to illustrate what he means by this. I have a pain in my arm. I could go about trying to figure out how it occurred and how it can be removed. Or on the other hand, I could take this pain as an example of a fundamental or essential state of affairs, that this world is permeated with pain, ill will, and suffering. This might lead me to further questions. What exactly is pain itself, apart from the fact that I now have this particular pain? And what must the fundamental nature of reality itself be like, given that pain as such is possible? So the act of ideation, first of all, intuits the essence of something, instead of focusing on its specific instantiation in relation to me, here and now. And further, it intuits its essential relations to other things and to being itself at various levels. A little later, he uses the classic Platonic example of mathematics, intuiting the essence of threeness, its essential qualities and relations to other numbers, from the transient appearance of three things. Scheler says that the insights disclosed in ideation are valid for all possible relevant objects, are independent of contingent sense perception, and are valid for all beings with spirit. In the language of philosophy, they are truly a priori. Now, the example Scheler chooses to illustrate ideation, the example of pain, is significant in two respects. First, because the problem of suffering may be a key reason why Scheler's religious and metaphysical views shifted away from Christianity to those we've been describing here, as I'll discuss in more depth in a future video. And secondly, because, as he acknowledges, the process outlined in that example parallels almost exactly one of the key moments in the life of the Buddha. The young Buddha, a prince sheltered in his palace from the miseries of life, goes out one day and encounters one old man, one sick man, and one dead man, and through these singular encounters immediately grasps the essential nature of life and renounces his riches in order to seek enlightenment. Scheler seems to greatly admire the Buddha in this late stage of his thought. He refers to him no less than 8 times in this brief book. Twice he refers to the Buddha's incomparable profundity. You may notice the influence of Buddha more strongly as we continue. How is ideation possible? Scheler says it results from a technique or method which can be described as a suspension of the reality of things in the world. As spiritual beings with a certain distance from ourselves and our environments, we can already encounter things as intentional objects. But we can also take these concrete objects and, by suspending the sense of reality, peel off the logos of essences from them. This isn't a merely logical or intellectual operation, but a basically existential act, going to the roots of our being. In this connection, Scheler invokes the Buddha, Plato, and Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, who taught the bracketing of the existence of a thing in order to get to its essence. Scheler critiques the way Husserl puts this technique of phenomenological reduction. He thinks it's too intellectual, as though merely bracketing the existence of things in one's intellectual judgment will get to the essence, or get one to the essences. But he thinks what Husserl was actually pointing to was the more fundamental act that Scheler describes. This is a fundamentally ascetic, self-denying act. To be human, says Scheler, means to launch a strong no against reality. But it's important to realize what Scheler means by reality. For him, the experience of reality consists in the experience of resistance. Nothing else can give us this experience. No permutations of perception can reach it. We experience something as real when it resists our drives, and deeper than this, the fundamental outward pressing impulsion at the core of our being that all life shares, that humans share with plants. For this reason, life is essentially suffering or angst. Quote, "For all reality, just because it is reality, and no matter what reality is for every living being first an inhibiting and constraining pressure, and pure angst without an object is its correlate." End quote. So the same act of ideation that lifts us to the essence of things also liberates us from the basic angst of existence. But to do this completely, it must get to the very root of impulsion within us. Quote, "In the form of pure will, only spirit can, by way of an active will, that is, by inhibition, effectuate the derealization of the center of vital impulsion that we came to know as the access to the being of reality." End quote. Now, this makes spirit look very powerful. It makes it seem very powerful, but the word inhibition is key. And we'll see in a minute when we look at spirit's decided lack of power why this is. That passage also makes it seem like ideation is an accomplishment only very few can achieve, perhaps only those of the stature of a Buddha or Plato. But just above this passage, Scheler makes the following remarks. Quote, "This act, which is at bottom an ascetic act of derealizing reality, if reality is resistance, can consist only in the cancellation of impulsion in relation to which the world appears as resistance. And this ascetic act is the condition of all sensory perception and all now, here, whatness of something." End quote. And of course, from the various examples of the contemplation of pain and of mathematics, we can see this act could be practiced by virtually anyone. Indeed, the quote I just read now seems to suggest that even animals have this capacity to some degree. A curious inconsistency that might make more sense, again, by the end of this video when we look into that question in more depth. I would therefore interpret what Scheler is saying is that we engage in partial acts of ideation all the time that deliver us partially from the pressure of reality to the essence of things. But a complete act of ideation is also open to us, at least potentially, something that might be akin to enlightenment in Hinduism or Buddhism, or directly beholding the forms in Plato. In one sense, this would be the pinnacle of what it is to be human. But in another sense, something else might remain. Here's where Scheler explicitly distinguishes his own view from that of the Buddha. While Buddha saw the final goal as deliverance from an existence which is fundamentally bad, Scheler believes that after the act of ideation one should, quote, "return from the sphere of essences back to the here-now whatness of reality to make improvements on it." Reality in this case is understood to be indifferent to good and bad, and to seek true life and the true destiny of the human being in adjusting the everlasting tension of the eternal rhythm between idea reality and spirit impulsion. End quote. And with that, we turn to the relation between these two principles, between Geist and Drang. Perhaps the most important aspect of Scheler's philosophy, which sets it apart from otherwise similar worldviews, is this: spirit itself is impotent. It has no power. But that doesn't mean it's completely without effect, for it can use impulsion towards its own ends. It does this in human beings through the processes Scheler calls directing and steering. Firstly, in directing, from the spiritual center of myself, I hold out an idea and a value before my drives. Specifically, I place an image or representation before them to attract or to lure them, as though with a bait, toward a particular course of action. At the same time, I may also withdraw attractive images that contradict this from my drives. Then, in steering, I inhibit or uninhibit certain drive impulses in a way that is conducive to my intended action. In other words, I either stop them from expressing themselves or allow them to express themselves once again. The energy from this constellation of constrained and released drives will then ideally flow toward the positive images I've set before it, in line with my originating spiritual intentions. The images, therefore, it seems to me, serve as a kind of intermediary in oneself between spirit and impulsion. So spirit can attract or withdraw attraction, and it can inhibit and uninhibit, and in this way it can alter the flow and expression of energy already existing in one's drives. But Scheler is clear about what spirit cannot do. Quote, "It can neither produce nor withdraw any energy in drives, nor can spirit increase or diminish this energy." End quote. The basic idea is that the human psyche is something that we cannot simply override, but must contend with, in a sense, on its own terms. This basic idea was a hallmark of the discipline of psychoanalysis that was rising at the time. Scheler mentions all three of its major luminaries in the book, Freud, Adler, and Jung, and he focuses on Freud and seems to owe the greatest debt to him. In particular, he takes up his concept of sublimation. While the repression of one's drives can often result in psychological illness, neurosis, it can sometimes happen that this repressed energy is instead directed into positive, higher, culturally productive activities. Freud basically attributes all of higher culture to the sublimation of more basic energies like sexuality and aggression. And Scheler agrees with him, though with an important twist, as we'll see in a minute. Sublimation is the process of directing and steering that occurs in the human being. It is how spirit gains a certain control over impulsion and comes to realize itself in the world. Through sublimation, spirit, originally powerless and dependent, in effect gains more and more power and independence over time. As Scheler puts it, this process is the coming to life of spirit. Intriguingly, Scheler goes much farther than Freud and seems to extend the process of sublimation to all levels of the cosmos. At every level, there is a certain order that at once shapes and is dependent upon a stronger and more chaotic substrate. Atoms in regard to subatomic particles, molecules in regard to atoms, life in regard to matter, spirit in regard to life. If this were the case, then the sublimation that occurs in the human being, quote, would also have to be seen as the last process up to now of sublimation in nature, end quote. There's one more thing I want to mention before proceeding to the next points, and this is what happens if one tries to directly control one's drives without the sublimating process of directing and steering. In other words, if I strive through sheer force of will alone not to do something I desire, not only is this useless, it tends to have the opposite effect. Scheler says something very profound about this. Quote, "Willing always produces the opposite of what it wills when, instead of intending a higher value, whose realization makes us forget what is bad and attracts human energies, it directs itself instead to a mere fight against and negation of a drive whose goal appears to our conscience as bad. Thus the human being also has to learn how to tolerate himself, even those inclinations which he recognizes to be bad and pernicious. He should not fight them directly, but learn to overcome them indirectly by mobilizing his energies toward valuable tasks known by his conscience to be good and proper and possible for him to achieve." End quote. And Scheler cites the wisdom of St. Paul, who knew so well the futility of striving to follow the law by willpower alone, a futility which is at once inflaming of the very aspects of oneself one wants to suppress. We'll turn now to two theories about the relation between spirit and impulsion that Scheler believes are false. He calls them the classic or classical theory and the negative theory. We'll deal with the classic theory first. Scheler calls this the most dangerous because it spans the whole of the philosophy of the West. The tendency to inadvertently fall under its influence is therefore the greater. This theory, whose origin goes back to at least Plato and Aristotle, holds that spirit has power, that, quote, ideas have their own power and their own activity and effectiveness, end quote. This stems from a fundamental error, that the higher a form of being is, the greater its strength and power. But Scheler maintains the exact opposite is true. That which is higher is weaker and more fragile than what is lower, because it depends on it for its existence. The inorganic world has a proud independence, and only a very few places supporting this fragile thing called life. And among life, we find that animals depend on plants far more than vice versa, and humans depend on both far more than vice versa, and the highest points of human culture are brief and rare. But this is necessarily so, and it's somehow almost right that it should be so. Quote, short and rare is what is beautiful in its tenderness and vulnerability. What is bare of all power and effectiveness is precisely spirit, the purer it is. End quote. Nevertheless, as I've mentioned, spirit does gain more and more a kind of de facto power through time, as the process of sublimation in human being, and perhaps the very cosmos, directs more and more energy into its service. So the classic theory rightly holds that spirit is its own realm of being, not reducible in essence to other factors, though it errs in directly attributing power to it. But the other theory Scheler discusses, which he calls the negative theory, errs in a different way. While it rightly apprehends the power of impulsion, it denies that spirit is its own autonomous sphere of being. It reduces spirit to the mere negation of a more basic energy, presumably, therefore, a self-negation. Scheler mentions Freud, Schopenhauer, and Buddha as being in this camp, while Freud holds that the sublimation of the energies of our drives leads to higher culture. He denies that this is at the same time a manifestation of an essential spiritual order. Metaphysically, it's all bottom up, and there's no top from which it could simultaneously be top down. In Schopenhauer's view, all is the blind will of life, and the highest act of the human being is his ascetic negation of that will. But again, because the human being is this will, this negation is the will's self-negation. And Scheler's understanding of the Buddha is similar. There is nothing beyond the reality of lived existence, and so liberation from the pressure of impulsion leads to nirvana, extinction. But against the negative theory, Scheler asks, on what basis does the repression of drives sometimes produce neurosis and sometimes the highest products of culture? Why is there a specific positive direction to sublimation? Why do the principles of spirit, at least in large part, coincide with the principles of being? And for the sake of what is this happening? The answer, thinks Scheler, is that spirit really and irreducibly is a fundamental principle of being. While in itself it has no reality in the sense of resistance to impulsion, nevertheless it manifests in the world, and to the extent we tune into it with the spiritual cause of our being, we intuit its self-evident and necessary structure of essences. So what is the relation between impulsion and spirit? Each are equally fundamental aspects of being, the one powerful but blind, the other powerless but seeing. In the human being they come together and interpenetrate through the process of sublimation. Through this process, so to speak, spirit gains impulsion's power and impulsion gains spirit's sight. The human being is a microcosm of being, containing not just these two fundamental principles, but all the levels of life, from the primitive impulsion of plants to the instincts, associative memory, and practical intelligence of animals, to the pure ideation of a spiritual being. For the human being is, for Scheler, quote, the most intimate unification of essential regions in the world, end quote. And this process of unification has far more importance than merely generating human self-consciousness and culture. Quote, to put it differently, a mutual interpenetration of originally impotent spirit and of originally demonic impulsion blind to ideas and values, an ideation in becoming, and a spiritualization of impulsion's sufferings from resistance behind the images of entities, as well as the simultaneous empowerment or vitalization of spirit. That is the goal and end of finite being and of history. Theism falsely puts the goal at the beginning, end quote. Theism puts the goal at the beginning. In other words, God is the goal of history. In the final portion of his book, Scheler turns to fundamental metaphysics and things divine. This is pages 61 to 66 in the Frings translation, though there's also a brief but important section at pages 50 to 51, which is where my closing quote on the last slide was from. The philosophical anthropological consideration of the nature of the human being as spirit and impulsion naturally leads to a consideration of absolute being, in which these two principles inhere. What is the ground of being for Scheler, and how does it relate to what we typically understand as God? Well, if we understand God as essentially personal being, then absolute being is not God. But Scheler definitely believes there is a positive, self-subsistent ground of all being. There is, as an essential necessity, quote, a being through itself comprehended with the predicate holy, which may have thousands of colourful manifestations, end quote. The sphere of the holy, of absolute being, is as constitutive of the human as our self-consciousness and our awareness of an open world from outside that world. When a human being discovers himself thus above and beyond the world, a sort of bewildering dizziness sets in. He realizes the possibility of absolute nothingness and asks, why is there a world at all? And why is it that I exist in the first place? The answer comes as a spiritual intuition entwined with the felt value of the holy. In addition to having the quality of self-evidence, it fits with and makes sense of all his other experience. But it is not a mere intellectual inference, an operation of discursive intelligence, which would be powerless by itself to deliver him this insight. If we were to transform it into an inference, we might say something like this. On the one hand, the contingent existence of the world must be grounded in a necessary and absolute being. Specifically, this would be through the divine attribute of impulsion. And, on the other hand, that there are essences to be found in the world that transcend our individual and transient minds means there must be an absolute spirit in which they inhere, which, to account for the fundamental unity of being, must be another attribute of the same absolute being. Now, to be clear, this is my own extrapolation of what Scheler might mean, drawing on this book as well as his earlier work, as what he says here is only very brief and elusive. In particular, I'm drawing from the book on the phenomenology of religion that he published toward the end of his Catholic period, The Eternal in Man. The problem is that his religious and metaphysical views in that earlier book were very different. So I've tried to update what he might say in terms of his late philosophy. What he does say amounts to this, that, as I've mentioned, the sphere of the absolute is constitutive of the essence of humans, that being through itself is comprehended through the predicate holy, that just when the human being, through spirit, becomes aware of himself in the world, he, quote, by necessity also had to grasp the most formal idea of a transworldly and infinite and absolute being, end quote, in a brief passage on page 34, that we must postulate a higher than individual spirit, quote, on the grounds of the essential interconnection that exists between act and idea, if we are to accept a self-realizing order of ideas in this world independently of human consciousness, end quote. And finally, that the propositions I am and the world is do not precede the proposition there is absolute being, but rather that, quote, consciousness of world, of self, and of God form an unbreakable structural unity in the same sense that the transcendence of objects and the consciousness of self have their origin in the same act, end quote. In this work, therefore, these are pretty much all the clues we have as to how we can know there is absolute being. But let's move on. So we have this being through itself, this ens a se, as Scheler terms it in Latin, and this is the fundamental unitary ground of all being. Then, within this ground, we have absolute spirit and absolute impulsion. The first he terms the deitas, or deity. Inasmuch as we consider God to be absolute spirit, this would be God, only pure spirit has no power. At this stage, the deitas is neither a real personal God nor has any power to create. This is God waiting to be incarnated, you could say. Not just into matter and history, as with the Christian God who pre-exists as a personal being, but incarnated into reality, made real. This is God waiting to be. The second principle, absolute impulsion, Scheler calls this, following scholastic philosophy and Spinoza, he calls this natura naturans, nature naturing, the active, self-generative aspect of nature. As of yet, it is pure energy or force without order or meaning. The theistic creation out of nothing is impossible in Scheler's system. If we had to use mythical language and describe the creation, we'd have to say something like this, quote, the ground of being had to uninhibit its world-creating impulsion when its deitas willed to realize the fullness of things and of values that were residual in it, so that the ground of being could realize itself in the temporal course of world processes. The ground had to pay a price, as it were, to realize its essence in and through this process. Being through itself could become being worthy of divine existence only to the degree to which it realized the eternal deity in the impulsion of world history in and through the human being, end quote. So again, it's specifically through the human being that God realizes himself, not just in the sense of image, but in the sense of initial reality. Now, in the next sentence, Scheler clarifies that this is in fact a timeless process that only appears in time. So that's why I've said the quote I just read is a mythical description of creation, something metaphorical that nevertheless illuminates being, at least for Scheler, more accurately than that of an omnipotent God creating out of nothing. So, God is becoming through the human being. In a sense, the human being's self-consciousness is God becoming aware of himself. But even more than this, the human being's intuition of essences and values and his realization of them in himself and the world is building up God himself and widening his consciousness. Scheler remarks, quote, for me, the fundamental relation the human being has to the ground of being consists in this ground grasping itself and realizing itself in the human being who is, because he has both spirit and life, a part of the ground's own spirit and impulsion, end quote. Scheler acknowledges this as the same thought as Spinoza, Hegel, and many others, but Scheler says this basic insight has been overly intellectualized. This knowledge, if it is to be genuine, has to spring from, quote, our active dedication of the center of our being to the ideal call of the deity and to the attempt to execute this call and to co-create God in this execution." End quote. This is the highest and best way to relate to divinity, but there are other ways. Scheler distinguishes two basic responses to the situation the human being finds himself in, an earthly creature somehow outside the cosmos and faced with the realm of the absolute. The first is what we've already described. Scheler says it is to pause and wonder and start directing his spirit to grasp the absolute and become a part of it. This is a kind of spiritual metaphysics and arises only late in history among a few peoples. Though I question this when I consider, for instance, the antiquity of the sages of India who wrote the Upanishads. But in any case, the second response is that of religion, which is older and far more common. In this response, the human being, with his huge surplus of fantasy and an overriding urge for protection, fills out this absolute realm with imaginary forms and figures to give him comfort and protection. And within this approach, there are various specific ways the relation between the human and the divine can be conceived. From among Western monotheistic religions, Scheler distinguishes a few. The idea that we are God's slaves. The more enlightened idea that we are faithful servants to the High Sovereign Lord. The idea of a covenant between God and one human people, as in Judaism. And, quote, the highest possible form of monotheism, the idea of human beings as children of God the Father, mediated through God's Son, both of co-equal spirit. God's Son reveals the inner nature of God and prescribes with divine authority doctrines of faith and commandments. End quote. Scheler still has high praise for Christianity, but then he says, we must reject all these ideas of religion for the sake of that first metaphysical response to the absolute. One of the key reasons for this is that all of these ideas objectify the absolute. But the absolute, like spirit and like the personal center of each human being, cannot be objectified. Creating representations of the divine and engaging in prayers or rituals to secure its protection and favor are, at best, confusions and distractions. It may seem that the alternative, the idea of an unfinished God and becoming, would be hard to bear. And on the final pages of the book, Scheler says he was once told this, but he replies, somewhat abrasively, quote, metaphysics is not an insurance company for weak people in need of protection. Metaphysics requires and presupposes human beings with strong and courageous minds. End quote. It is understandable that humanity turned to religion. Quote, the need for protection and support by a non-human transworldly almighty power identified with goodness and wisdom was too great not to have broken the barriers of sense and contemplation at the time of human beings' immaturity. End quote. But the time for that is over. What the idea of the unfinished God and becoming affords is a relation of genuine cooperation with God as we help him to realize himself in ourselves and the world. We can relate to this God and becoming in the way we best relate to other human persons, by acting for and with them. Quote, instead of such childlike and effete self-distancing from God as we see in the objectifying and hence evasive relation to God in contemplation, worship, and prayers of supplication, we posit in contrast a basic act of personal readiness to act for the deity, as well as our self-identification with its directions of spiritual acts in any sense of this term. The ultimate being of what is through itself is not an object, exactly in the same sense as a person is not an object. One can partake of ultimate being's life and spiritual activity only by co-execution, by the act of our readiness to act and by active identification. End quote. And thus we come to the end of our exploration of Scheler's final vision of the human and his place in the cosmos. That is to say, in one sense, as its microcosm. In another sense, outside it. And in another sense, as the place where God comes into being within it. In my next video, I'll examine in more depth the change in Scheler's thought beginning around roughly 1922 that led him to this vision away from the Christianity he had adhered to. But finally, for this video, there's a few questions I want to bring up regarding his final vision. Scheler's late thought has frequently been described as a form of dualism with its two opposing fundamental principles of spirit and impulsion. That's true to a point, but ultimately I don't think it's the best characterization. Firstly, because both principles are equally rooted in a unitary absolute ground of being. At the deepest level of Scheler's metaphysics, being is one. Secondly, the two principles are not completely and utterly opposed. Whilst of different natures, they readily interpenetrate in the human being, and perhaps in the cosmos as a whole. When they come together, they, as it were, transform each other, each providing what the other needs. In fact, when Scheler distinguishes his philosophy from that of another thinker, Ludwig Klages, who viewed spirit as more destructive of life, he has this to say, quote, "Spirit and life are dovetailed. It is a fundamental mistake to think they have since their beginnings been against each other in hostility and struggle." End quote. And finally, there may not be only these two. Spinoza held that God has infinite attributes, but that only two are known to us. Scheler seems to be at least alluding to him when he says the following of Spirit and Impulsion on page 65 as though in passing, quote, "It is only in the human being and in his selfhood that these two attributes of the ens a se that are known to us are in living relation to each other." End quote. The second question concerns the powerlessness of spirit. Even within the logic of Scheler's vision, is it really powerless in itself? We've discussed how spirit gains a kind of de facto power over impulsion via sublimation, that is to say, by directing and steering pre-existing drives. But aren't these activities of directing and steering themselves an exercise of power? Can we imagine the inhibition or disinhibition of drives as acts requiring no expenditure of effort, force, or energy at all? Likewise, can we imagine the placing or withdrawing of attractive ideas and images before the drives as utterly effortless activity? In his insightful and wide-ranging book on Scheler's philosophy, called Scheler's Ethical Personalism, Peter Spader argues that Scheler doesn't really mean to deny spirit all power, but only a particular kind of power, creative power. Spirit cannot create out of nothing. It cannot, as we've heard him say, directly produce or withdraw energy, increase or diminish the energy of the drives. But it can, so to speak, shape that energy, channel it and direct it. This is a form of power, broadly understood. That Scheler seems to deny all power to spirit is perhaps a rhetorical excess in this first presentation of his new philosophy, which was to precede the full systematic exposition to come. On page 205 of his book, Spader remarks that Scheler, quote, uses the term power to refer to creative power alone, perhaps because he was over-concerned to deny the classic thesis of the creative power of Geist, end quote. This partly resolves a concern critics have repeatedly raised about his late work, that Drang and Geist are so unlike each other that they could never come to interact. But there's another major aspect of this concern that remains unresolved, and that is my third question. On the scale of being, how far down does spirit go? Now, in one sense, it goes down to bedrock, to the ground of being itself. But at the same time, the way Scheler presents his philosophy in his book, it seems like it plays no role in the cosmos until the advent of the human being. In fact, he calls it a new principle, opposite anything we call life and irreducible to it. The impression one gets is that each level of life before the human being is merely a pure mutation of impulsion, out of its own resources, so to speak. But this presents a problem, which Ernst Cassirer put well in his excellent 1930 essay on Scheler's late philosophy called Spirit and Life in Contemporary Philosophy. First, he quotes the passage from Scheler I quoted earlier in this video, in which Scheler contrasts originally impotent spirit with originally demonic impulsion blind to ideas and values, in order to proclaim their mutual interpenetration in the human being as a kind of divination. But Cassirer asks, quote, how is life capable of seeing the ideas that spirit holds up to it and of directing its way by them, as by starry constellations, if its original nature be defined as a mere drive, i.e. as spiritually blind, end quote. In other words, if the drives and all the rest of the animal nature of the human being are essentially blind, how can spirit even begin to guide them by the ideas or images it holds out to them? Spader's answer to this, and I find this fairly convincing, is that while Scheler does in places seem to explicitly reject the appearance of spirit prior to the human being, he implicitly accepts it. Indeed, his philosophical vision depends on it. As Spader states on page 206 of his book, quote, if Geist is indeed an attribute of the ground of things, it cannot make its appearance only with the human being, end quote. We can get a sense for its earlier appearance if we compare the way the first level of life is described, the impulsion of plants, versus the inorganic level below this. As we've seen, the impulsion of plants is a movement and feeling in one, a directedness, though a general one, toward or away from soil or light. And plants have an inwardness, though no consciousness. But Scheler says there is a sharp difference between this lower level of impulsion and the force centers and fields of force that form the basis of our perception of inorganic bodies. For the force centers and fields have no inwardness. Later in the book, Scheler expands on this basic inorganic level of the cosmos. This is from page 48 in the Fring's translation. Quote, what is most powerful in our world are the force centers of the inorganic as the lowest energy quanta in this impulsion. These force centers are themselves bare of ideas, forms, and gestalts. According to a view that is gradually gaining broad acceptance in contemporary theoretical physics, it is likely that these force centers have no ontic laws in their behavior toward and away from each other. They appear to obey only laws of a statistical nature, end quote. He's referring, of course, to quantum theory, which really had only just come into its own at the time Scheler was writing. We see in this passage further differences between the inorganic level and the lowest level of life. There seems to be no meaningful directedness, even of a general kind. This is a kind of chaos, or the closest to chaos we can get, with an apparent lawfulness emerging only on the statistical level. We notice something else here, I think. Scheler seems to contradict what he said earlier, that there is a sharp difference between impulsion and force centers. But now he says that the force centers are the lowest energy quanta in impulsion. In other words, the inorganic is also a manifestation of impulsion. This was a puzzle as I was going through the book, but I think we have to take this latter statement as his definitive view. After all, if the inorganic is neither spirit nor impulsion, what is it? But if both inorganic force centers in plant life are forms of impulsion, we can ask with Spader, what accounts for the difference between them? When we consider this, it seems that the difference consists in a closer approach to the qualities of spirit, more perception, more directedness, more order, more meaning. And if we trace the ascent of life through instinct, associative learning, and practical intelligence, we find at each stage increasing indications of the influence of spirit. And even at the most basic level of quantum force centers, even here there seems to be a dim manifestation of spirit. They have some level of determination, a term Scheler explicitly links to spirit in his Problems of a Sociology of Knowledge. They are, after all, centers. Their fields are more or less determinate fields, and their regularities, though only appearing on the statistical level, are nevertheless distinguishable from utter randomness. So if spirit already pervades all the cosmos, at least in some form, and increases with each level of life, then Cassira's question of how the blind drives see the bait of spiritual ideas proffered to them is no longer a problem. The animal already has a spiritual receptivity, a capacity to see built into it. Spader concludes on page 210 of his book, quote, "Though human Geist is indeed a new principle, insofar as it introduces a very new type of factor of determination into the universe, the above analysis makes it clear that Geist does not appear only with the appearance of the human being. Geist, or at least its analog, appears at all levels of being, and so is present before the human Geist, with its power to ideate, and so its new level of freedom appears. Yet, by the time we get to the level of development represented by a life form that has instincts, seeing is part of that life's process." End quote. And yet it is, I think, undeniable that the way Scheler presents his thought in The Human Place in the Cosmos conceals this continuity of spirit through all levels of being. Spader argues that just as Scheler overemphasizes the impotence of spirit in order to counter the classic theory of spirit as all-powerful and creative, so he overemphasizes the uniqueness of spirit in the human being to counter the negative theory of spirit as merely the self-negation of the life force. But if we remove these rhetorical overemphases, a vision emerges of a naturally far more integrated cosmos, though still one that is growing through the gradual interpenetration of two fundamental principles. In this revised vision, spirit already contains something like impulsion within it by its very nature. That is to say, it has a kind of power of its own. And impulsion, from its lowest manifestation in quantum particles and fields upwards, is already shaped or determined by spirit to some degree wherever it is found. So tentatively at least, I believe I have answers to the first three questions, but for the final question I have no clear resolution. Let me know in the comments if you have found something that sheds light on this. The question is this: in what way exactly is the God in becoming personal? As we discovered, Scheler holds that human beings are persons, and what it means to be a person is to have a spiritual center, which isn't any kind of substance or thing, as it were, behind a person's acts, but rather an unobjectifiable, self-executing ordered structure of the acts themselves. The person is the unity of their acts. This suggests the uniqueness and irreducibility of each person. It also suggests at one and the same time their concreteness and transcendence. I am the specific unity of all my particular acts, but this unity can never be turned into an object. It seems, at least initially, that every being with spirit must have their own irreducible spiritual center. But Scheler complicates this picture with his view that God is coming into being through us. He explicitly says that God realizes himself in and through the human being. So, does the God who is becoming have his own spiritual center? And how does it relate to ours? The way I see it, there are three different ways that Scheler's God may be personal. First, it may be the case that he has his own spiritual center, just as humans do. There's some support for this in the language of cooperation Scheler uses to describe our relation to God. For example, on page 35, he talks about our, quote, acting jointly with the supra-individual spirit in genuinely co-creating and co-producing the essences coordinated with the eternal logos, eternal love, and eternal will, end quote. And on page 66, he speaks about the need for our personal readiness to act for the deity and to co-execute his acts. If this language is more than metaphorical, there would have to be someone genuinely there for us to cooperate with. The problem with this interpretation is that if there is someone there, how does that personal being exist? Scheler's repeatedly emphasized the necessity of impulsion for existence. Existence is resistance. This suggests that embodiment in the forces of life, in a body and mind, is required to be an actual living being, spiritual or otherwise. Indeed, this seems to be the whole point of why God needs us to realize himself. We are so embodied, while he, at least initially, is not. So if he exists as a person distinct from us, where is his body and mind? And how does what we win over to the service of spirit by way of sublimation transfer, so to speak, to him? The second option is that God doesn't have his own unique and spiritual center, though each human being does. In this interpretation, God can still be said to be personal, in that he comes into being with each and every human being, as each and every human being. And so he necessarily develops and comes more and more into being as human beings develop themselves through sublimating the energy of impulsion into the service of spirit. The virtue of this interpretation is its simplicity. We don't have to posit a real personal being out there somewhere, somehow subsisting independently of us, yet also strangely intertwined with us. The weakness is that this would render a lot of Scheler's language at best merely metaphorical, and it seems to go against the metaphysical thrust of his system. A third and final possibility is that only God has his own spiritual center, of which ours are just particular instantiations. Perhaps it's a misreading of Scheler's late philosophy to suppose that each human being has their own personal center in an ultimate and irreducible sense. I think there's some support for this in another essay Scheler wrote in the final year of his life called Philosopher's Outlook. It was published as part of a collection called Philosophical Perspectives after his death, and I'll link to an online version of this in the description. This is what he says on pages 11 to 12. Quote, "The spiritual person of man is neither a substantial thing nor a form of concrete entity. Man can rejoin his spiritual person only by acting." So far, so good. For this person is a hierarchical organic unit of spiritual acts which at any moment represents the unique and individual self-concentration of an infinite spirit, one and always the same, the root of the essential structure of the objective world. End quote. In another late work, On Immortality, that has also been published posthumously in a collection titled The Constitution of the Human Being, Scheler uses similar language. After acknowledging that individual human beings have a kind of immortality through what they contribute to the becoming of God, he denies them a unique personal immortality. This is from page 217. Quote, "But there are no grounds for assuming an everlasting after-existence for a person, independent of the being of the basis of all things, which would be the same for all human beings, regardless of whether they conducted their lives more akin to animals or to God. The eternal mind is at will to loosen the ties which bind individual clusters of self-concentrated spirit, mind and spirit, which are anyway only an ordering of acts, as soon as they have fulfilled their purpose and rendered their contribution to the self-development of God." End quote. These passages seem to grant human beings only a relative degree of personal being, for which the personal being of God is the substrate and is absolute. This would be distinct from the second interpretation I proposed, in which only humans are persons, and God by himself is only a kind of disposition or potential that comes into actuality with each and every person. In other words, the second interpretation is that ultimately God is us, while the third interpretation is that ultimately we are God. The problem with this position is it's not clear how God could underlie us all as the true unity of our various acts. Remember, the person isn't bare consciousness to be filled with any content whatsoever, or something like that. It's a meaningful whole. Could a single person subsist in such boundless self-contradictory diversity as manifest in all human life in the cosmos? So each of these interpretations has its virtues and its flaws. Scheler uses language suggestive of each of them, and often in close proximity. In Philosopher's Outlook, for example, just a few lines after the passage I quoted about the human person being a self-concentration of an infinite spirit, Scheler's back to talking about us as co-creators, co-founders, and co-executors with God. Now, it may be that I've simply failed to grasp what he's saying. It may be that it's genuinely riven with flaws. Or it may be that at the end of his life too, his philosophy was still dynamic, still in development, still something to be further worked out. In any case, the precise theology of the late Scheler, this for me at least, remains an open question. And this is perhaps an appropriate way to conclude this video. If we are essentially world-open beings, ever discovering more of being, realizing by our widening love and knowledge in some mysterious but perhaps not unfelt way the divine being,